What's up, biology students? It's Mr. Holloway here with a video for you about ecosystems. And today's video is going to cover specifically these things called biotic and abiotic factors and how these two things relate to one another and to the ecosystem as a whole. So, our planet is literally covered with life, and there's a lot of different levels that we could be talking about when we're talking about living things. We could be talking about an individual organism of a single species. We could be talking about a population of organisms all made up of members all of the same species. We could be talking about a community of organisms, which is made up of different populations of organisms living together in the same area. We could be talking about ecosystems, and ecosystems include both the biological communities of organisms that exist there as well as the non-living parts of that environment that those organisms depend on. We could be talking about biomes, which are collections of similar ecosystems. For example, there are rainforest biomes and tundra biomes and desert biomes on planet Earth, and each one of those biomes is made up of a bunch of different ecosystems spread out across the planet. Or we could be talking about the biosphere as a whole, and the biosphere refers to all the ecosystems on the planet. And like I said, our planet is literally covered with life. Now, the amazing thing about life is that in some form or another, life can exist pretty much anywhere. And in this map, you can see that all the land on our planet is literally covered in ecosystems. All these different ecosystems support different communities of biological organisms, and those different communities of biological organisms depend on unique sets of abiotic or non-living factors to keep them alive. But pretty much everywhere you look, you're going to find life on our planet. We even find life in the water that covers our planet. We have stream ecosystems where the water is always moving. We have lake ecosystems where the water is usually standing still. There are a variety of wetland ecosystems like bogs, marshes, and swamps where there's water covering the floor of that ecosystem for at least part of the year, and life has to get by for part of the year being covered in water and usually dry for part of the year. And there are ecosystems where the river meets the sea, where sometimes it's a little bit salty and sometimes it's a little bit fresh, but it's never quite as salty as the ocean and never quite as fresh as streams or lakes. And we call these places estuaries. And we have salt marshes and mangrove swamps, and life has figured out a way to live in these places as well. Even our oceans are teeming with life, and depending on how deep you go and how much light there is and how much nutrients are available and potentially what kind of predators and things like that there are, you can find all kinds of interesting organisms living in our oceans, from the very, very large to the very, very small. We even find life living on the bottom of the ocean, where we know for a fact it can't be living off of the sun because no sunlight can make it down that deep. No, these organisms that are living at the bottom of the ocean get their energy instead from these hydrothermal vents, and life has figured out a way to turn this into an energy source that ultimately can fuel a food chain that exists on the bottom of the ocean where no sunlight can penetrate. And humans as well are a part of Earth's ecosystems. We take our resources from the environment and we put our waste back into the environment. And as such, we have a very special relationship with our planet and with our ecosystems because we depend on it. That's why we've also developed a science that we call ecology, so that we can understand how we interact with the environment. Although human beings have an amazing ability to modify our environment to suit our purposes, just like all other organisms on the planet, humans also depend on a healthy, functioning ecosystem for our survival. So it's in our best interest to understand how ecosystems work, and that's what ecology is all about. It's the study of ecosystems and how they work. If we're going to understand how an ecosystem works and how it's able to support life over a great period of time, then we got to understand what that ecosystem is made of. And all ecosystems can kind of be broken up into two categories of things. We've got the biotic factors, or the living things that make up that ecosystem, and we've got the abiotic factors, or the non-living things that make up that ecosystem. So let's begin by talking about some of the important abiotic factors that make up an ecosystem. Some of these you're probably familiar with, but others of them you may not have thought about very much. Water is obviously an important abiotic factor. All living things need water, and some organisms, in fact, need to live in the water to be able to survive. Soil is another important abiotic factor, as are the amount and type of nutrients in the soil. Actually, if you're a water-dwelling organism, the amount and type of nutrients in the water is going to be important for you. The pH of both water and soil is an important abiotic factor that influences what kind of organisms can live in that water or in that soil. Day length is another important abiotic factor. The longer the day length, the more plants are going to be able to grow. The shorter the day length, the less time plants are going to have to be able to grow. And of course, the amount and intensity of sunlight is important for the same reason. Seasonality is an important abiotic factor. Some ecosystems have pretty much the same thing going on year-round. Other ecosystems, like rainforests, have kind of two seasons, like the rainy season and the dry season. Here we have 4 seasons: spring, summer, winter, and fall, and that affects what kind of organisms can and cannot live in this environment. The average and daily temperature is important. Some organisms simply can't live in places where it gets too hot or too cold, and where the temperature gets outside of their range of tolerance. Humidity is also important. Some organisms can't live where the air is too wet or where the air is too dry. Topography. The shape of the land affects how water runs across the land, so it affects what kind of organisms can live there. Precipitation patterns, whether it rains a lot, a little bit, all at once, or spread out over the course of the year. The amount of oxygen is obviously important, although we sort of take it for granted, but there are places on the tops of mountains where humans simply cannot live because there's not enough oxygen in the air to support them. Wind and air movement are important, especially if you're a plant that pollinates by wind and air. And even things like ultraviolet radiation from the sun are important. In some places that are maybe getting too much ultraviolet radiation are going to be inhospitable for certain organisms that have a low tolerance for that kind of thing. So none of the things that you see listed here on this slide are living, but all of them are very, very important in determining what kind of organisms can and can't live in a particular ecosystem. If we look at this list of abiotic factors that we just made, we might notice that quite a few of these things are related in some way or another to weather and climate. Things like humidity, things like precipitation patterns and day length, things like wind and air movement and average and daily temperature and even seasonality. All of these things are related to these things that we call weather and climate. And it's important not to confuse these two things because a lot of people do confuse weather and climate, but they are different, although they are related to one another. Weather, for example, is the conditions of the atmosphere at a particular point in time. So that describes what's going on right now. It might be hot and sunny, it might be cold and cloudy and raining, and that's our weather. Climate, on the other hand, describes the average pattern of weather experienced by an area over a long period of time. Climate might be the single greatest determining factor in what kind of ecosystem you're going to find on a given location on the planet. So let's talk a little bit about what kind of factors influence climate. First of all is position on the planet, and depending on where you are relative to the poles or the equator of our planet, that's going to have a big impact on what kind of climate you have, and as a result, what kind of weather you're going to experience throughout the year. For example, if you live in this band that we call the tropics, this band here around the center of our planet is called the tropics because it receives the most direct sunlight throughout the year. And direct in this case means that the sunlight is coming pretty much straight down from overhead. So you have a lot of very concentrated sunlight coming down and hitting you from overhead, and that means that those areas are going to be pretty warm overall. The farther you get away from the tropics, the less direct the sunlight becomes. And if you look at this figure here, you can see that while this, call it a band of sunlight, is illuminating kind of this much area on the planet near the tropics, that same amount of sunlight is illuminating this much area closer to the poles. And since that sunlight is coming in at an angle, it's a lot more spread out, it's a lot more diffuse, and that means that these areas are going to be a little bit cooler. They're going to have more pronounced seasons and a greater difference between summer and winter. For example, this part of the planet that we call the northern hemisphere right now is going to be, in this picture anyway, is going to be experiencing its winter months because it's getting very, very, very diffuse sunlight spread out over a very, very, very wide area. And you might consider that when it's winter around here, the sun is often very low in the sky, and that's because it's coming in at an angle like this. Down in the southern hemisphere of our drawing here, they're going to be experiencing summer, and that's because the sunlight is, while not as direct as it is near the tropics, it's considerably more direct than it is up in the northern hemisphere. And that means it's going to be warmer for them. That's their summer, while up north, that's going to be our winter. Another big influence on the kind of climate you're going to be experiencing at any given point on the planet is the way that the atmosphere is circulating. And here in this drawing, we can see that near the equator, air in the atmosphere is kind of going upwards. And that's because the equator is very, very warm. It's because it's receiving all of this direct sunlight, and warm air rises. So as that warm air is rising near the equator, it's also losing a lot of water. And that's why it rains so much at the equator, and that's why we find so many tropical rainforests near the equator. But as that air continues to move north and south, it's going to cool, and cool air sinks, so it's going to eventually fall back down towards Earth, and as it is cooling, it's going to be warming up, and it's going to be sort of absorbing water, because warm air can hold more water than cool air. So at these regions, around about 30 degrees north and south latitude, we're going to find a lot of deserts because that air that's sinking down towards the planet is getting warmer and warmer and warmer as it sinks. And because warm air can hold more water, it's absorbing water, and it's not going to be raining as much in those areas, whereas it's going to be raining a lot near the equator. Not only does position on the planet have a big influence on what kind of climate you're going to experience, the shape of the land has a big impact on climate. Here on this page we can see an example of something called the Rainshadow Effect, which is actually something we experience here in Colorado pretty much every day. And we live in this area called the rain shadow. And just like warm air near the equator is going to rise, get cooler, and release its moisture, air that is forced up and over a mountain is going to do the same thing. So as this warm, moist air is forced upwards as it travels over the mountains, because of course it can't travel through the mountains, this air becomes cooler. Cool air can hold less water than warm air, so the extra water is released as precipitation. So on that side of the mountains, it's going to rain a lot, because most of the time, air is going to be moving in this direction, so our weather is also going to be moving in that direction, and that means one side of our mountains is going to be getting an awful lot of rain. On the other side of the mountain, however, the side that we call the rain shadow, that same weather now gets to fall back down. It gets to come back down closer to the surface of the Earth, and as that cool air is falling, it gets warmer and warmer and warmer. Warm air can hold more moisture than cool air, so as that warm air is moving across the land and causing evaporation, that water that's evaporating is just being held by the air, and it's not raining on that area. So on this side of the mountain, the side that we call the rain shadow, you have a little bit more of a desert-like environment. And here on the eastern slope of the Colorado Rockies, this has a big influence over our climate and is a big part of the reason why our summers here are so dry and hot. We live in a rain shadow, and every single day of our lives, the mountains to the west of us are influencing the kind of weather we get here on the eastern slope. Gases in the atmosphere that surrounds our planet have a big impact on our climate as well. And some of these gases, called greenhouse gases, are responsible for a really important thing called the greenhouse effect. And the greenhouse effect ultimately is what makes our planet livable and what keeps it warm enough to support life. And the way it works is analogous to how a greenhouse works, which is why it's called the greenhouse effect. It's also analogous to how your car works on a hot, sunny day. And if you've ever been inside of a car without the air conditioning on, with the windows rolled up in the full sun, you know that it gets pretty hot in there. And that's because sunlight passes through the glass and it strikes surfaces inside of the car or inside of the greenhouse. It warms up those surfaces as a result, and as those surfaces are radiating that heat out into the space inside the greenhouse or inside the car, that same glass that allowed the light to come through in the first place prevents that heat from escaping again. So it holds that heat inside the greenhouse or inside your car on a hot sunny day, making it pretty warm in there. An analogous thing happens with gases in our atmosphere. As light from the sun comes and strikes our planet, it's going to be absorbed by surfaces on our planet, and that's going to release heat. That heat then is going to be trapped by our atmosphere and re-radiated back down to the planet, ultimately keeping our planet warm. The greenhouse effect is what allows there to be liquid water on our planet, and if we lived on a place without the greenhouse effect, there's no way that our planet would be warm enough to support life. So it's a really important thing, but it's an important thing also for us to know about because our actions have a big impact on the greenhouse effect. We'll talk about that a lot more later, but for now, suffice it to say that these gases in our atmosphere help hold heat close to the surface of our planet, making our planet warm enough to support life. And ultimately, in some way or another, that's going to influence all ecosystems on the planet. Collectively, all of these abiotic factors play a big role in either supporting or preventing life in a particular ecosystem. And any one abiotic factor could be responsible for preventing a particular kind of organism from being able to colonize a particular ecosystem. But the biotic factors are equally important in a fully functional ecosystem. So let's turn our attention to the biotic factors that influence an ecosystem. And biotic factors, remember, are all of the living organisms that make up an environment. And we can sort of subdivide all of these living organisms into different groups depending on what kind of jobs they do in that ecosystem. And although all of the organisms that live in an ecosystem are important, there's one particular group of organisms without which there would be no other organisms living in that environment. And these are the things that we call autotrophs. Autotrophs are important because they're like the base of the food chain. And they're able to fulfill that role because they have the special ability to make their own food. And that's why we call them autotrophs. And they're not only able to feed themselves, but because they're able to manufacture their own food, they're also able to feed everything else in the ecosystem as well. And autotrophs accomplish this in one of two ways. Some organisms use a process called photosynthesis, whereby they use the sun's energy to help them make food. Other organisms use a process called chemosynthesis, whereby they use chemical energy to help them manufacture their own food. But regardless of whether an organism is using photosynthesis or chemosynthesis, basically what it's doing is it's turning inorganic carbon into a source of carbon living things can use. So plants are an example of photosynthetic autotrophs because they use the sun to make carbohydrates that then they use to feed themselves and all of the other organisms in the ecosystem. Chemosynthetic organisms are a little bit more rare, and these are organisms that live primarily in places where the sun doesn't reach. So for example, bacteria living on the bottom of the ocean, some of them are able to use this process called chemosynthesis to help them build food. Because there's no sunlight available, they get their energy from chemicals that are available in these deep sea hydrothermal vents, and they use that chemical energy to help them produce food that ultimately supports the entire food chain down at that depth. Whether or not an organism uses photosynthesis or chemosynthesis to do its job, we call these organisms primary producers because they are able to produce their own food. And if you're not an organism that's able to produce its own food, you're what we call a heterotroph. And heterotrophs have to get their nutrition from some external source. Some heterotrophs are what we call consumers, so they get their nutrition from consuming other organisms like plants or other animals. Primary consumers are consumers that eat plants. They're primary because they're the first animals in the food chain, so they're the first heterotrophs in the food chain. Whereas other consumers are secondary consumers, meaning that they eat other consumers rather than eating producers. And there are tertiary consumers that eat secondary consumers, and sometimes it might go up to a fourth level or perhaps even a fifth level, but not usually much beyond that. So these consumers are consuming other organisms to get their nutrition. Another really important variety of heterotroph is the decomposer. And decomposers are organisms that behave kind of like the recyclers in any given ecosystem. They break down old dead stuff, and organisms like fungi and soil bacteria are going to work on dead plants and dead animals, getting their nutrition from these and also breaking them down into their basic components and returning these basic components to the soil so that they can be reused within that ecosystem. And all of these different parts are really, really important in any ecosystem. And every ecosystem is going to have both autotrophs and heterotrophs. It's going to have producers, consumers, and decomposers. And all of these different biotic factors are going to be working together to help that ecosystem function. And organisms depend just as much on the non-living things as they do on their environment. And as living organisms, that means that humans depend on our ecosystem as well. We are a very important biotic factor in any ecosystem that we are a part of, sometimes for better, sometimes for worse, but science can help us understand our role in the environment and the role that the environment plays in our lives. Alright, that's all we have in our video for today. Please remember that you can go back and watch this video as many times as you need to make sure that you've got the concepts and are able to use the vocabulary. Thanks for watching, and we'll talk about some more of this stuff the next time I see you in class.